We're going to be in chapter 5 of Ephesians tonight, and we're going to continue the duties of the members of Christ's body. You might recall that Paul in Ephesians, as in many of his writings, kind of divides things into first, here's the doctrine, and secondly, okay, here's the how-tos. From chapter 4 through 6, we're in the how-tos of Ephesians, and we're going to be in chapter 5 tonight, which I'm going to title. Actually, I didn't title this. I'll tell you who really did, the Expositor's Bible Commentary. Be imitators. And if you look at your outline, they do a really good job of saying what that means or what imitators is. In your outline, there's just the Roman numeral 1, which is, here's the doctrine, then Roman numeral 2, here's the how-tos. But if you go down to about mid part of the page, you'll see an item D, to be imitators of God. That's all of chapter 5. And they lay it out nicely by walking in love, by walking in light, by walking in wisdom, and by walking in the Spirit. That's being imitators. The chapter itself can kind of be divided into two sections. First of all, being imitators, verses 1 to 21, and then wives and husbands. And what's going to happen in the last part of this chapter is we're going to move into a section on, okay, now that you are imitators, what should relationships look like? And this is going to be addressed to the members of the church. What should relationships look like in the church? And we're going to deal with kind of three different groupings. Interestingly enough, the admonition or the encouragement for wives and husbands and children and slaves and masters happens not just in this book. We're also going to see it in Colossians. We're going to see 1 Peter talk about it as well. But they've never been designed as being exclusive. In other words, these are three typical relationships we should find in the church. What should those relationships look like? So that's where we'll be. And we're going to hit 5 kind of what I'm going to just call key notes or key factors here. First of all, be imitators, which the whole chapter is based on. We're going to see in verse 1. Secondly, be lights in verses 8 through 10. Thirdly, expose the darkness in verses 11 through 14. Fourthly, submission in verse 21. And then finally, as I said, we're going to enter the first group of relationships, and that's the relationships between husbands and wives. Now, logically, the first 2 verses of this chapter, as we talked about last week, really belong in chapter 5 because it continues the progression. We're going to include them in our chapter today, in our chapter study today, but you're going to notice in verse 3, there's going to be a major shift in the theme to living as children of light. Now, as I said, I'm not going to read all of these verses, so I'll rely on you to read all the pieces of the puzzle. I'm going to hit just kind of the highlight verses that we need to be aware of as we go through chapter 5. So start in chapter 5. I'm just going to do the first 4 verses to begin with. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. So you can tell immediately where the division takes place. As soon as we get into chapter 3, we've been talking about what Paul talked about throughout most of chapter 5. He kind of summarizes in the first, through chapter 4, kind of summarizes in the first 2 verses of chapter 5. Be imitators of God, therefore. And then this verse 3, notice how verse 3 starts out, by the way. But, biggest word in the Bible, but. So we're going to make that shift when we get to verse 3, but let's deal with this question of imitators first, our first first bullet point on the list for tonight. And the point is this, that believers are to follow the example of God's actions. He loved us when we were still enemies. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. One of the things that always just flabbergasts me and brings me to my knees every time I read it is in Romans chapter 5, when it says some people might die for a good man. Very rarely will anybody die for just a regular man. But while you were still sinners, Christ died for you. Well, the point being that by being imitators, we're going to imitate the fact that he loved us when we were still his enemies. And as imitators, believers should demonstrate that type of self-sacrificial love. We're going to see the word love several times in the next, this chapter, part of the next chapter. In all cases, it's going to be agape love, which is one of the 4 words used in Greek for love. Agape means self-sacrificial. Let me hit just 3 points on this issue. First of all, in the King James Version, it's not called imitators. I still like the word, but in the King James Version, it's called followers. In Greek, that word is actually mimetis, which we get our word mime from, or to mimic from. In other words, a follower in Greek would be somebody who mimics or mimes or replicates what someone else is doing. Well, who would we be replicating here? Jesus, right? That brings us to our second point, and that's this. We've talked about this before as well. Christians. We've talked about if you're going to take the name Christian, you should act like a Christian, shouldn't you? Well, again, recall that that name isn't used, or that word isn't used until Acts chapter 13, some 15 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. And it was done, as we've said before, as a kind of a pejorative term. In other words, Romans and Jews would say, oh, those Christians, you know them. Boy, we still kind of get that today, don't we? Yeah. So it was not an honoring term at the time, but it became the term that Christians adapted for themselves because it literally meant small Christ or Christ follower. Well, again, if you're going to follow Christ, if you tend to follow anyone, you tend to emulate what it is they do, right? If you're going to follow Christ, shouldn't you be emulating his actions? Shouldn't you be an imitator? Shouldn't you be a follower? Shouldn't you mimic what Christ's actions were? And the third point I wanted to make was this, that this summarizes the Christian behavior pattern that was begun all the way back in chapter 4 and verse 25, when it started talking about imitating the actions of Christ. That all is summarized in the first 2 verses of chapter 5. Now you'd probably think, here's where our chapter should begin because of the major change that it makes. It starts with the word, but. So let's look at verses 3 and 4 again. But among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality. And now Paul's going to use some pretty negative descriptions, but the negative descriptions are related to what the Christian should not be. So he's going to say, but you should not be. And remember, but is always going to have, well, I can't say always. Normally, but is going to indicate something that has changed differently, is different from what Paul has just said. Now he's going to say, but don't be this way. So let's look at some of the words here. You notice he uses the term sexual immorality. In Greek, that word would be porneia. That's where we get our term pornography. So it's here, it gives a couple of samples of it, but the reality is it means any kind of sexual immorality. That would be a huge issue for the at least one half, or at least a part of the audience in Ephesus. Remember, the Ephesian church is made up of both Jew and Gentile. Well, Jews would have understood the prohibition about sexual immorality from the 613 laws, etc. Gentiles, or sometimes called Greeks, would not have understood that because it was a foreign concept to them. Recall that, and we can even take a look at a picture of it. one of the biggest buildings in Ephesus at the time was the Hall of Artemis. Artemis is the Greek name for who will become the Roman goddess Diana. She was a goddess of fertility, and I think this is accurate. At one point, there were over 1,000 temple prostitutes that served there. Well, so you can understand how Gentiles would have been saying, well, wait just a minute. The gods we have served in the past, that was part of the religion. Paul's saying, don't have anything to do with any of that. So again, for the Jews, that probably would have made some sense because of the law. For the Gentiles, different question. There's one other picture that's worth looking at. We looked at this before too. This is, and I took this particular picture. I took this picture. I was there. And I had to pull this off the internet. The reason I did was to show you the intricacy of what was in that, and this was a huge edifice at the time, the intricacy of the carving and how it was so magnificent at the time. This was a temple to a fertility goddess where a lot of these things would have been practiced. Now, the pagan temple that was dedicated to her that we see here, the Greeks would have understood as being part and parcel of their religion. Well, look what Paul says. Don't be, I want to make this point as well. But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Recall that Paul is writing this 2,000 years ago. It has no applicability today. Well, you guys did better in the morning class. I didn't even get a guffaw out of the morning class, but it sounds just like today, doesn't it? You can't tell me that this book is not timeless. What Paul is talking about is the very same thing we see happening in today's society. And I'd like to say, well, I wouldn't like to say, we can see it in our country, but I'm afraid it's an epidemic worldwide. Paul is then going to go on to talk about another word. By the way, a couple of these are going to be listed in the 7 deadly sins. The next one is greed. Greed is defined as the desire to have more of anything. Doesn't necessarily have to mean more of money, greed is an insatiable desire to have more of something. Colossians talks a little bit about it as well, and they further identified it as idolatry. So behind this identification is a Jewish understanding of idolatry as the root of all sin and of greed as the sin encompassing all sins. In other words, greed motivates, in the Jewish thought, greed motivated all other sins. There was a theologian in the 17th century by the name of J.A. Bengal. He made this comment. Greed motivates all other sins. It is the highest act of revolt away from God. Desire takes the place of God, for it, rather than he, determines life. This was in, 1687 or so. J.A. Bengal was a German theologian. Many people call him the father of critical exegesis. He's the first one that really came around to find all the different versions of the Bible and began to parse those in terms of what the original language said. He says that greed is the most egregious sin of all because it takes the place of everything God does. So Paul says, first of all, avoid sexual immorality. Secondly, avoid greed. And here's the third one. And I want to do this with the King James because I think King James does a great job of it. In verse 4, well, let's finish what he said in verse 3. Don't do any of these, and look at what the because is. Because these are improper for God's holy people. So what is Paul doing now? He's describing who God's holy people should be. If you, in our last week's session, if you took off the old man and put on the new man, what should that new man look like? So he's given the description now of what the new man should look like, or what the Christ follower should look like. And then he gets to verse 4. I'm going to read it out of the NIV, but then I'm going to go back and look at what the King James says. Nor should there be any obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. You know how the King James phrases that? The sins of the tongue. I think that's a much better way of saying it. So, and the verse is an expansion from chapter 4, verse 29, which deals with the same thing. There's 3 words here that are used, though, that you might notice. He talks about there should be no obscenity, there should be no foolish talk, and there should be no coarse joking. He describes those 3 things. This is the only place in the Bible, the only place in the New Testament where those 3 words are used. And he's doing it to show that it's the tongue who typically gets us into trouble. We talked about that a little last week too. James is the one who really brings that to the fore when he tells all the problems. James devotes at least a whole chapter to the problems you can get into with the tongue. Paul here is saying, don't have coarse language. Well, once again, he's talking to people 2,000 years ago. It has nothing to do with today. I'd like to say that's true. It is not. I can't tell you how many, some of you probably go to the rec center on occasion up here. If you do, you will be flabbergasted at the kind of language coming out of 12, 13, 14-year-old high school, junior high school girls. Boys as well, but for some reason it just doesn't seem, well, it doesn't seem right to have coarse language out of anyone. But today, that is part and parcel. And it's pretty disappointing. We get another but here, though. Look in verse 4 with me one more time. Nor should there be any obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. And here's the point he's making. The reason for not wasting time with unwholesome speech is given in this part of the verse. If one is focused on foolish talk, there's no room for thanksgiving. There's no room for praising God. If your entire mindset is spent on what's the next word I'm going to come up with, you're not spending any time on thanksgiving in your relationship with God. Dale?
There's a game called Relative Insanity. And I don't know if anybody's seen it. And, you know, when you play it, it's kind of off color. I would put it in the coarse jesting, I guess, thing, which I've been guilty of. And most of the coarseness relates to either crudity or sexual implications. I can't think of anything else offhand. But that's something that our society is filled with, the coarse jesting.
And that's part, the big issue for me, Dale, is it's become normalized. It's accepted now. You know, 20 years ago, if somebody would have said that in a mixed group, somebody would have called them down. I have been at the rec center. I haven't been met with very much. It's usually, you're some kind of a expletive old man. So I just pop them in the mouth and we keep going. But that's the issue, Dale, is just as in Paul, we keep thinking, well, things are so different. They were exactly the same back then. In fact, when Paul writes the letter to the Corinthians, he's dealing with those major issues in the Corinthians, to the point that, and we've talked about this before too, the term Corinthianized came about in Paul's time to describe somebody who is sexually immoral, basically a dastardly dude.
But the one thing is excellent here is he goes on and he tells the consequence. Has any inheritance in the kingdom of Messiah and God. In verse 5.
Yep.
It's got very serious consequences.
It does. Unfortunately, I can't say that true. I can't say that for sure. I was going to say most of the people today don't care about or don't recognize the consequences. It may be that they don't care or recognize them yet. Because I believe that everybody has the potential for salvation. I guess I'm the only one that believes that. Apparently Peter did too, so did Paul, so did virtually everyone in the first century church. Jerry?
One of the things I really appreciated, the commander I had in the Air Force in Germany, his first staff meeting, he told staff that he did not want to hear any profanity. He said, everyone in this room is a college graduate. If you can't find a different word, you can borrow my dictionary.
That
was unusual because the military is known for a lot of four-letter words.
That's interesting because I've used the same thing. Do you know there are 1.7 million words in the English language? I told a young guy that at the rec center here recently. Do you know there are 1.7 million words in the English language and you continue to use one? It didn't get very far. Let's go back and kind of finish this section with verses 5 and 6, and that's this. Go with me to verse 5. For of this you can be sure, and Dale hit it a minute ago, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a man as an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Then I'm going to stop there because we're going to hit the next word here in just a minute. But I wanted to point this out. Verses 5 and 6 summarizes all of this. Look at the words, for of this you can be sure. Literally in the Greek, it would be worded this way. For this you know, knowing. In other words, you know what this means. Paul reminds his readers of information they already know, that sexual sin and greed are not fitting for God's people, and that those who commit such sins will not inherit the kingdom of Christ and of God. Again, the concept, I'm sure, is getting clearer and clearer to the Gentiles. The concept should have been part and parcel of Judaism from the time the law was given, because many of the 613, I can't tell you how many, but many of the 613 laws, precepts, and regulations deal with impurity, sexual impurity. They deal with greed. They certainly deal with idolatry. So at least the Jewish members of the church would have had an inkling about what's going on. I think the Gentiles are still in the process of assimilating. I did want, before we leave this section, I did want to read how the King James deals with this, mostly because you have to love the language. In verse 5, for this ye know, that no whoremongering, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. When is the last time you heard the word whoremongering? Well, that comes from the King James, but it paints a very colorful picture, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. None of these will have an inheritance in the kingdom of God. Now, we have to understand here, well, Paul's talking to the members of the church. He's not saying the members of the church that way. In fact, he's going to say, you once were this way, but you aren't anymore. He's talking to the members of the church, but he's talking about those who are outside the church. And he's going to make the point in a few minutes about, maybe not tonight, might be in chapter 6, about how to deal with those people outside the church so that eventually they get to the same point you are. Now, let's move on to our second kind of bullet point on the board tonight, and that's this, be lights. And that's going to be in verses 8 through 10. But I want to read verse 7 first. Therefore, do not be parties with them. Therefore looks back at everything he just said, right? If therefore is there, figure out what it's there for. He's looking back and he's saying, do not be parties with any of these. In other words, have nothing to do with them. And then he goes on and he says this. I'm going to read verses 8 through 10. 8 through 10. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists of all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Well, I want you to notice a couple things about this. The believer's position has changed from darkness to light. Do you notice what he said here? For you were once darkness. In other words, he's saying you were just like the people I just got through describing. But now you're light. You've moved from darkness into light, or to righteousness, from sin to righteousness. Believers are to change their walk to correspond to their position in Christ. And he reminds the Ephesians of the difference in who they were and who they are now. This would fit so nicely with what we saw in chapter 4 about taking off the old man, putting on the new man. Fits exactly with that. And the hearers had to make the same connection. If we are the new man now, doesn't that indicate our actions should be different? Not only that, but shouldn't our actions reflect something? That is, they should reflect the light. They are not only are living in the light, but I want you to notice what he says here. He says, for you were once darkness, but now you are light. Not you're living in the light. He says, you are the light. You following me? I want to deal with that a little bit more here as well. This morning's group, we had quite a few guys. It's called the Masters Men group, which is interesting because half the members are women. But the Masters Men is where it got started. So we've been doing a study in the message in the Sermon on the Mount from John Stott's book. John Stott wrote a book 1978. But you could read stuff out of here today that you'd say, this is today. He did this in 1978. It was called Christian Counterculture. Do you remember when we did our whole session on culture today and the differences between it? Well, his point was Christ was a countercultural revolutionary, as were his followers. And he talks about, as he's going through the Sermon on the Mount, he gets to the section on light and salt. And in that, in the light section, I did a study with the Masters Men last week on this, and I made 3 observations about light. And I wanted to just share those observations with you because it's germane to what we're talking about tonight. The first one is this. The entire Bible is bracketed by light. I want you to think about that for just a minute. We've talked over and over and over about something called an inclusio, bookends. Let me read to you out of Genesis chapter 1. If we're in Genesis chapter 1, how early are we in the Bible? Pretty early, aren't we? Yeah, in the beginning, that's right. So we're pretty early. Not only that, but we're going to be in the 3rd verse. This is just the 3rd verse in Genesis. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from darkness. You'll notice God did not create darkness. Darkness was there. He separates the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Aside from creation, after creating the universe, the very first thing God creates is light. Now, let's go to the other end of the book and see what it says, and we'll get our second bracket here about light. If you're in chapter 21 of the book, you're about done. The only thing left is finish chapter 21 and read chapter 22. Here's what John says about the New Jerusalem, the new temple, the new city. He says this: the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. And the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. We start the book with light, we end the book with perpetual light, and everything in between is light. And you'll find time after time after time in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, lightness is connoted with righteousness, darkness with sin. Let me make the second observation here. Go home tonight, pull out your Oxford English Dictionary, which I'm sure is sitting on the shelf, probably sitting on your end table, because you probably use it a lot, don't you? Or you can just type it in if you want to. If you type in darkness definition, you know what you're going to get? Absence of light. In other words, there is no darkness, there is only absence of light. So what would Paul's hearers be hearing when he hears him say, you are light? What he's saying is, you're the light that shines in the darkness. Let me give you my third observation. Light has two related functions. One is to illuminate. We can see everything around this room, right? There's a second function, it's related to it, and that is to reflect, right? If I made a little joke about Alexander's haircut a while back, and I said the light was kind of, well, that reflection is something that I see on Alexander. That same reflection should be something that others see on Christians, shouldn't it? Shouldn't we be reflecting the light? First of all, shouldn't we illuminate? Secondly, shouldn't we reflect? Let me tell you the main issue with that, or the main problem with that. In order to reflect light, in order for people to see you, you better be walking in the light, right? What's one of the chief things you hear about, the chief detractions you hear about Christians today?
They're hypocrites.
They're all hypocrites. Well, there's a reason for that. How do we act versus how do we talk? So when Paul says you are the light, he's saying not only should you illuminate, you should reflect where the light's coming from. That's Christ. If you're reflecting what light's coming from, which is Christ, the people that see that can only see the reflection of Christ and Christ in you. Does that make sense? So I'll just summarize my three observations. 1, the entire Bible is bracketed by light. 2, there's no such thing as darkness. There's only absence of light. 3, there are two related functions, illumination and reflection. In other words, we should be reflecting the light. And you'll notice the way all of this started out. It started out with in Christ. Now, I do want to hit one more parenthetical statement here. Parenthetical, that's a big 25-cent word. Just means there's parentheses there. If you go to verse 9, here's what it says, and most of you probably have this. Well, let me ask this. If you look at verse 9, how many of you have it in parentheses? The majority? There were no parentheses in ancient Greek, so this would be, but the thought is in parentheses. In other words, he's saying this. For the fruit of the light consists of all goodness, righteousness, and truth. So what he's saying is that reflection is the reflection of goodness, righteousness, and truth. By the way, it's not your righteousness. That righteousness is being reflected off where righteousness comes from, which is Jesus. Make sense? And the last point I wanted to make about this is he uses this word in his writing, and it is this. In other words, he's talking about being witnesses for God. Here's the word that he uses in Greek, phoster. It's P-H-O-S-T-E-R. Sounds like phosphorescent, doesn't it? Or something that shines. Well, phoster literally means light giver. In other words, you are to be a light giver, used figuratively of believers as shining in the spiritual darkness of the world. So I'm having a bunch of T-shirts printed up that says, "We are Fosters." Let's move on to since we've dealt with light, let's move on to the next bullet point, which is exposing darkness. And Paul's going to deal with this in verses 11 through 14. I will finish up what he said in verses 11 and 12. We didn't deal with that. But what he does say is, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Now, if he's saying expose them, what is he talking about? Bring them to the light of day, right? Well, if you're going to expose them, and you're going to bring it to the light of day, you got to bring it to the light of day of someone or something, right? For it is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. Remember the two characteristics we talked about, illumination and reflection? For it is light that makes everything visible. That is why it is said, "Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine in you." Excuse me. Let's look at verse 11 and 12 for just a second. And, excuse me, through this section on expose the darkness. The command in verse 7, not to partner with the disobedient, is explained further in verse 11. Excuse me. Dale, you know the other problem with carrots? You tend to get a little bit caught in your throat on occasion. Go back to verse 7 and notice how he ends that section. Therefore, do not be partners with them. He's going to make the same point when he gets here to verse 11. And he's going to say, for it is have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. That's the them he's talking about in verse 7. So he's saying not to partner with the disobedient is expanded here with the command not to participate in their actions either. In other words, have nothing to do with them. The NIV says have nothing to do with them and instructs believers not to share in or participate with wrongdoing. Dale?
How do you expose the darkness? Well, first of all, someone that sees light doesn't recognize it necessarily as light. They think they are.
Good point.
And the church has kind of lost a platform on which to confront the darkness. I mean, I'm sorry, but the Durango area always comes to mind. And the number of times that I've written to Ann Swan, she's almost becoming a burden on my heart. You know, she really doesn't know how bad off she is.
Yep. I want to make sure we pick this up, Dale, so let me paraphrase you. First of all, you excoriated the Durango Herald, rightfully so, right? And then you talked about one of its editors being in darkness. Just want to make sure. That's pretty much it, right?
I mean, I feel bad about it.
Well, that is, I want you to think about that for just a minute. When we did our whole session on culture and the church, do you think for a minute that anybody that's in takes the cultural side of it, thinks they're wrong? I believe they know instinctively, and if they were honest enough to reflect on it, they know instinctively they're wrong. Because Paul tells us in Romans, the first chapter of Romans, he says, you can see it. It's been plainly pointed out to you. So this deal has more to do with refusal to see the light than it is the inability to see the light. You follow me?
Yep.
So when Paul talks about deeds of darkness, and he says they're fruitless, he means they're useless in producing what God desires. They fit the darkness. They do not fit with Christ. Such deeds produce nothing of value in God's eyes. If Christians are light, they cannot participate in darkness. As a result, They cannot participate in such acts. I think that's part of why we get such a rub from non-Christians, is they look at you and say, I see what you're saying, but I don't see you doing what you're saying. So the separation Paul calls for, however, is not a withdrawal, not as much as a withdrawal as it is a confrontation. And he uses the word in both verses 11 and 13, expose, which often carries a nuance of correcting or convicting someone, which it does, but there's another definition to it. I'm going to bring up here in just a minute, because we've gotten to another one of my magical words in verse 13. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for it is light that makes everything visible. But the question that must be resolved is whether the revealing is merely negative, exposing other people's faults, or whether a positive element exists as well, so that people are both exposed and transformed. The context requires both those. And since the word translated expose in Greek also means convince, it isn't just expose, it is also to convince in Greek, this is understandable. The person who is exposed and convinced by the light is transformed. And then Paul has this quote, probably from Isaiah, but some think Paul might have made up one of his quotes from past sayings as well. And he says this, awake, you who sleep. Could be a fragment from a first century Christian hymn, or its origin was with Paul. But it most likely references Isaiah 26:19 and a promise of God's coming salvation. The context here indicates 3 stages of the work of grace in verses 13 and 14. And here are the 3 stages. First, people are exposed. Second, they allow themselves to be revealed. And third, and then they become the light. Here's the difficult part. People are exposed. They allow themselves to be revealed. Then they become light. That puts the onus on us in terms of the exposure. And I'll define Irish diplomacy for you just one more time. The ability to tell a man to go to hell in such a manner that he looks forward to the trip. The point being, the exposure has to come in such a manner that the individual you are talking to, you aren't saying to him, you're going to hell because. You're saying, well, let me tell you what the Lord says about that and why he's in command of my life. That's the way that you ultimately are going to get to agreement and finally to transformation. And then we get in verse 15 and 16. Before we get to submission, I wanted to deal with one more thing. And that's look at verse 15 and 16. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand that what the Lord's will is. I want you to go back to this first part of this. Be very careful then how you live. The King James does a really great job of this. It says this, walk circumspectly. Circumspectly is to step gingerly, but they use that term walk again that we've talked about so many times about living life, and how walk is such a better term for us because we get the image of walking arm in arm with Christ. Walk circumspectly in the way you live your life. The main statement in this section is in verse 5, the first part of verse 15. Be careful, or walk circumspectly, then how you live. The rest of the verses 15 to 21 provides descriptions of what that entails. Literally, the text says, watch carefully or closely how you walk. And in verses 17 to 20, it gives you how to walk circumspectly. I'm going to read through those because it's going to get us to verse 21, which is going to be the springboard into our session on our piece of the puzzle here on submission. So start with me in verse 17. Therefore, there's therefore again, right? Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music in your heart to the Lord. Always give thanks to the Lord the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. By the way, the reference to getting drunk and debauchery really has to do with anything that's going to detract you, anything that's going to pull you into something other than what God intends for your life. And all of these end up at the same place. Everything in Jesus Christ. Now we get to this verse 21. Everything at this point has led up to this, and it's going to talk more now about how to do this. So look at verse 21 with me. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So verse 21 kind of completes the thought of the previous verses, 18 to 20, that you just got through reading, which addresses how being filled with the Spirit manifests itself in the believer's life. If we were reading this, just as Paul would have intended it, as one letter, this would be a seamless transition to the next verse. Now, my Bible has a headline there that we won't see anyplace else that says wives and husbands. Yours probably may have the same thing. In Paul's audience, that would not have been there. It would have read this way. Go back to verse 20. Always give thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands. You know, it's a continuous thought. And it's going to deal with our next bullet point here, which is submission. The term submission is something we should pay a little attention to. First of all, I think I mentioned earlier, Ephesians, Colossians, 1 Peter, they all give instructions to wives and husbands. They all give instructions to children and parents. They all give instructions to slaves and masters, so this was not uncommon. But again, it wasn't exclusive to just those groups. The basic principle of Christian submissiveness that governs the community life of the church applies to all social relationships. But they take the three that were the most common at the time. That between husband and wife, that between parent and child, and that between slave and master. We'll talk a little bit more about slave and master here in just a second as well. So Paul chooses these as the most conspicuous of the relationships and shows how they are transformed when controlled by obedience to Christ. Let's deal with the submitting part. The Greek word for submitting doesn't refer to being under the absolute control of anyone, of another, but to voluntarily placing oneself under the authority of another. Now, I want to hit 4 points on the concept of submission. Paul develops two ideas side by side with submission. The first is this, the one who is submitting, and then notice what else is there. The appropriate response to the one to whom submission is given. It's not just you will submit and that's the end of it. It's you will submit and the person you are submitting to will act like this. You see my point? You get both ends of the point here. But the mutual submission view does not adequately reflect the meaning of submission in Greek. The Greek term for submission actually has military origins, emphasizing being under the authority of another. Well, in today's all-volunteer army, if you volunteer, you are volunteering to put yourself under someone else, a superior of some type. Jerry, were you drafted or did you volunteer?
There was no draft when I went in.
Oh, that's right. So I guess it was all volunteer then, right? So you willingly chose to put yourself in submission to someone higher than you, right? Well, that someone higher than you also had a responsibility to you, correct?
And he had somebody that he reported to.
Yeah, that's right. So the concept actually comes from the military in terms of I am submitting myself to you to serve you, knowing that in a reciprocating relationship, something is going to happen with me. Either whatever it is, you're going to help me, you're going to take whatever it is, something is going to come from this relationship. And the word actually means to retire, to withdraw, or to yield. So Paul seems to be saying that wives should voluntarily place themselves under the authority of their husbands. The same word is used to describe Christians voluntarily submitting to governmental authorities and younger people submitting to elders. But there's a but, isn't there? And we're going to get to the but here in a few minutes as well. So the final point on submission is this. In this passage, Paul gives the illustration of the church's submission to Christ. If you view all of this, and if I had to pick one of the most controversial issues there is with Christianity today is, the women are subjugated in every case, right? In fact, if you want a good exercise, go home and type in husbands and wives, or husbands and wives, Ephesians. You'll get 2.3 million responses. So the husband and wife issue becomes a huge issue to those who are not Christians. To those who are Christians, the first thing we see is, first of all, it's voluntary submission. Secondly, who are we submitting to? The creator of the universe. That ain't so tough, man. And thirdly, it's in almost every case, it's associated with the relationship between Christ and his bride, the church. I did, for some reason, I'm going to have to read it now because I have it lined out here, so it must be something good. The Expositor's Bible Commentary talks about this. Let me tell you what they say. In verse 22, submit. The legally binding exclusiveness of the marriage relationship is thus underlined. As to the Lord, differs slightly from as fitting in the Lord, which we'll find in Colossians. In obeying her husband, the Christian wife is obeying the Lord, who has sanctioned the marriage contract. It should be noted that Paul says is within the context. What Paul says is within the context of Christian marriage. He's not implying that women are inferior to men or that all women should be subject to men. The subjection, moreover, is voluntary, not forced. The Christian wife who promises to obey does so because her vow is as to the Lord. That's the part that's often missing in discussions today when people say, well, the church subjects women. Now that we know that. Deb?
I do think that there have been people misunderstand that in the church.
I agree.
And it has been abused.
I agree.
By
Yep.
people in the
I agree.
church, too.
I think that's true. I think any rule can be abused.
Yeah.
And it can be abused by the rule makers as well as those who are not the rule makers. So I agree with that. I think what we need to, probably should focus on is what Paul is saying here in terms of relationships. And he's talking about relationships in the church, talking about the relationships between Christians. But I think that's a good point. Jerry, you'll have to speak up real loud so we pick you up, Jerry.
I had a lesson in authority once. I was flying on the commanding general's airplane, 4-star general. We were flying from Spain back to Germany. There were some young guys on the plane, and the general stopped to talk to us. And one of them said, "General, it really must be scary to have your finger on the nuclear button." The general looked at him and he said, "Son, I don't have my finger on the nuclear button. The President of the United States does, and I'm glad it's him, not me."
Now, boy. Oof. Sorry, Jerry, I'm just kind of, I understand what your point is, but I'm kind of putting.
The point was, everybody has authority above
Yep,
them.
I got you. Unfortunately, I just put pictures in the places of the points you were talking about. That was not political commentary, by the way. Now, I want to just read this section on wives and husbands, and then we'll parse pieces of it. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. There's the key right there. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. There should be a but here, but there's not. The point is still the same. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. Now we are members of this body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. How many times did I use the word love? I didn't count them, but there's a boatload, isn't there? Every single one of them is agape. Agape is always rendered self-sacrificial love. If people would just take that one word in this whole section, it would be very clear what Paul is talking about in terms of submission. Let's go back to verse 23 and work our way through some of this. In verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. The Ephesians 5:23 doesn't focus on authority, but on self-giving love of both Christ and the husband. The head, in this context, suggests responsibility for. The husband has a leadership role, though not in order to boss his wife around or use his position as privilege. Just as Jesus redefined greatness as being a servant, Paul here is going to redefine being the head as having the responsibility to love, give oneself, and to nurture. In other words, he's going to say, you're responsible for this. In many ways, the husband's responsibility is greater than the wife's because it's his responsibility to act as Christ did, self-sacrificial love with his church. So the priority is placed on the husband, but contrary to ancient society, it is placed on the husband, contrary to ancient society, it is for the benefit of the wife. The activity of both wife and husband is based on their relation to Christ and his giving himself for the church. And then verse 25, we're going to get it again. Husbands, agape, self-sacrifice yourself. Husbands, love. Paul doesn't emphasize the husband's authority. Instead, he calls on husbands to love self-sacrificially. Husbands are to emulate Christ's love, the kind of love that is willing to lay down one's life for another person and serve that person even if it means suffering. Getting a whole different view, aren't you, of what submission looks like? Verse 26 and 27, in these verses, Paul is briefly going to outline what Jesus has done for the church. First of all, he loved the church so much that he was willing to suffer and die for it. Secondly, his actions not only saved the church, they also sanctified it. In other words, Jesus wanted to develop the church into what it should be, the holy temple of God. So he did two things. Look at verses 26 and 27 with me. To make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word. It's talking about the church, really. And to present her to herself as a radiant church without the stain. So Jesus did two things. First of all, he willingly sacrificed. Secondly, because of his sacrifice, he's presenting the church as holy and without stain to God the Father. That's called sanctification. In verse 29, a husband who realizes that his wife is truly his own flesh will treat her with love and care. you tend to think about that in terms of, okay, would I want something done to me that I wouldn't do to somebody else? Kind of the golden rule in one degree. Marie?
More and more I realize how much my husband loved me, because he was an aviator and he was going overseas. They told everybody on that crew, give your wife the power of attorney. Either put a date on it or put indefinite on it, because if your plane gets hit and you go down, indefinite means she has your power and your word to do whatever has to be done. I had a very good friend who had 3 children. Her husband was the pilot. He put a date on when they would return. He never returned. They never found his body, and she was strapped with 3 teenagers ready for college and 1 old broken down car and no power of attorney to do anything.
That's a really good point, because that submission is submission in perpetuity,
Yes.
right? Good point. Let's wrap this up with the last 2 verses. Verse 31. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the 2 will become one flesh. Obviously, that's coming directly out of Genesis, right? And the institution of marriage, and become one flesh. Paul's point is, you're not going to do something that's going to, well, most people wouldn't, imperil themselves. Why would they imperil somebody who they've just pledged agape love to, right? They've become one. It's the same individual. And then finally, we end up with this word mystery again. This is a profound mystery. Paul tells you what the solution to the mystery is. First of all, mysterion in the Bible simply means something not known that has now been revealed. And Paul tells you what it is. Notice what he says. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself. The mystery is simple. The mystery is submission should follow the pattern of Christ in his church. Love for the church and willingness to submit to Christ as the church. Jerry?
When my wife died, I went to the hospital a couple of days later to take candy and flowers to all the nurses. The head nurse in the Longmont Hospital called me into her office, closed the door, and she said, Mr. Day, this comes from all the nurses who were with your wife. We really admire what you did for your wife. Your treatment was special. And I said, I don't think it was special, that she would have done the same thing for me. And didn't what all husbands do? She said, you would be surprised how many do not.
Yeah. Sad commentary on our society, don't you think? So let's wrap up for tonight. And keep in mind, again, had we been reading this as a letter, which is what it was intended to, we wouldn't stop at this point. We'd move right into relationship with children and their parents, right? And then, from that point, into slaves and their masters. I will make one point for you, by the way. The concept of we're going to deal with the concept of slaves later. The Bible never makes a comment one way or another about this is good or bad. Kind of does in Paul's letter to Philemon. But what it does do is say this is what was happening in society at the time. Therefore, this is how the relationship should be. I would make the case that we could almost substitute boss and worker and get the same thing. So next week, we're going to come back and we're going to deal with the last 2 of these relationships, a children's relationship with the parent, a slave's relationship to the master, and then all of this up to this point has been focused on the church itself, right, and becoming one. And the last part of chapter 6 we're going to go outside the church. And Paul's going to deal with how to do that. All right, let's see. Alexander, how, do you feel like a good closing prayer?
Sure. Dear Lord,